Things you learn from Christian history, number 9. Without love, it's all just noise. Or in the words of 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3, though I spake with the tongues of men and angels, and yet had no love, I were even as sounding brass, or as a tinkling cymbal. And though I could prophesy and understood all secrets and all knowledge, yea, if I had all faith so that I could move mountains out of their places, and yet had no love, I were nothing. And though I bestowed all my goods to feed the poor, and though I gave my body even that I burned, and yet had no love, it profiteth me nothing. Copyright Paul of Tarsus, 54 AD. In this version, copyright William Tyndale, 1525. Chapter 9. Calvinism, Counter-Reformation, and Commonwealths. The salt of the earth. The same year that the peasants were publishing their manifesto, another new incendiary book was published in Worms. Well, not exactly a new book, it was the New Testament. But it was in English. It was the work of one of the greatest figures in English history, a man who has changed our culture more profoundly than virtually any mitred archbishop or miracle-working saint or any playwright or poet. His name is William Tyndale, about 1494 to 1536. He was born in Gloucestershire, and after studying at Oxford, conceived the idea of translating the Bible into English. He wanted to give the Bible to everyone, even the boy that driveth the plough. Naturally, this being England, his enthusiasm was frowned upon, A, because it was illegal, and B, because the English frowned upon enthusiasm of any sort. So, Tyndale had to work in secret. But after a few months, his plan was discovered, and he was forced to flee the country. He went to Wittenberg, Protestant Central, and within a year had completed his fresh, vibrant translation. What made it different was that Tyndale had gone back to the Greek, the Lollard Bibles used the Vulgate. And he was a truly great translator. No, scratch that. A truly great writer, full of vigour and energy. We still use many of his original phrases today. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. A law unto themselves. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. The apple of his eye, a land of milk and honey, let there be light, the powers that be, the salt of the earth, and many more come straight out of Tyndale's translation. As we've seen, this activity was illegal in England, so his books were smuggled in and distributed on a kind of Bible's black market. And it became a huge underground success. If you knew where to look, in the Tudor equivalent of car parks perhaps, there were distributors winding down the windows and saying, I've got some Galatians if you're interested. Any Romans? Nah, don't deal with the hard stuff. One of his main distributors was a man with a fantastically New Testament name of Simon Fish. Fish was a writer himself. His pamphlet, Supplication of Beggars, was an attack on the abuse of power by the Church. It centres around a notorious case of suspicious death while in the custody of the Bishop of London. A man called Richard Hun refused to pay a burial fee to his parish priest for the burial of his child. Hun was arrested on charges of heresy and taken to the Bishop of London's prison. What? Doesn't every bishop have his own prison? 2 days later, he was found hanging dead in his cell. The authorities said it was suicide, but the coroner found signs of foul play, and the evidence pointed to the Chancellor of the Bishop of London, Dr. Horsey. The bishop obtained a royal pardon for Horsey, and no charges were ever brought. Even in mainland Europe, Tyndale was not safe. He was forced to go on the run. His writings had made him enemies. It wasn't just the New Testament. His book, The Practice of Prelates, opposed Henry VIII's proposed divorce, making an enemy of the king. His most vehement, relentless opponent was Thomas More, who pursued heretics with a murderous zeal. Those found aiding distribution of Tyndale's works were burnt at the stake. Tyndale, in fact, was full of seditious ideas. He believed that it was better to try to convert the Turks than kill them. He disagreed with the death penalty for theft, or for heresy, in fact. He was seditious because he believed God's law was above that of the king. And by now, More was dead as well. Thomas More lied to Parliament, lied to the public, and was involved in acts of torture and sent countless people to their deaths. He is also the patron saint of politicians and statesmen. Irony doesn't cover it somehow. Tyndale's enemies caught up with him. He was betrayed to the authorities in Antwerp, condemned for heresy, and in 1536 was burned at the stake. As an act of mercy, and in the light of his fame, he was allowed to be strangled at the stake before the flames were lit. His last words, according to Fox's Book of Martyrs, were a prayer for Henry VIII, that his eyes would be opened. And indeed, they were. I'm Henry VIII, I am. It was not actually the English authorities who killed Tyndale. It was the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who at that time ruled an empire covering Spain, Burgundy, chunks of Italy and Germany and the Low Countries. I've just found out that Charles's parents were nicknamed Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad. That marriage guidance counsellor must have had his work cut out. Right. Henry VIII, or his officials at any rate, actually tried to get Tyndale released. Why? Because in 1534, England had gone Protestant. Henry had separated from Rome and established the Anglicana Ecclesia, the C of E. This was the mother of all U-turns, given that only a few years before he had been a very keen Catholic. He had even written books on it, and the Pope was a really big fan, loved his work. Henry's response to Luther's Babylonian captivity earned him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. The title is still used of British monarchs today. Few people know that it was the Pope who first bestowed it on the monarch, while he was actually defender of a slightly different form of the faith. But then something happened that shattered the faith of the defender of the faith. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had not given him a son, so Henry sought a new wife and was after an annulment of the marriage from the Pope. Normally this would have been no problem. Money might have changed hands, the whole thing could have been agreed easily. But Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, who at that time had control of the Pope, and as we've seen, much of Europe. There was no way he was going to let Auntie Cathy be disgraced by the English king. So, Henry underwent a double separation. First he divorced Catherine, and then he divorced himself from the Pope. Henry became the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Now, Henry was no reformer. His England was Anglo-Catholic, not Lutheran. But his new wife, Anne Boleyn, was very influenced by Protestant thinking, and the real architect of the changes was a Cambridge don called Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. The English Reformation, for Henry at least, was less about theology and more about those three old gods: money, sex and power. Sex? Well, that was Anne, until the old monster got tired of her, framed her on witchcraft charges and had her killed. And cutting the ties with Rome gave Henry more political power. And money? Well, that came from the monasteries. In 1536, Parliament passed acts dissolving the smaller monasteries. In 1539, they went after the big ones as well. Henry's attack dog was a man called Thomas Cromwell, who took the title Vicar General. Using a decidedly dodgy dossier of monastic abuses, he closed all the nunneries, friaries and monasteries in England and Wales, and confiscated their lands and treasures. Whatever the faults of the monastic orders, it was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism ever committed. Note that the people didn't welcome all this with open arms. In Lincolnshire, there was a protest march armed uprising led by a shoemaker who became known as Captain Cobbler. His real name was Nicholas Melton. Clearly he's the world's first superhero. This was suppressed, but was immediately followed by a more extensive uprising in York, which became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Led by a barrister called Robert Aske, the insurgents captured York and returned expelled monks and nuns to their houses. Then around 30,000 gathered at Doncaster. Henry was forced to negotiate. He promised that he would listen to their grievances and issued a general pardon to all involved. As soon as they disbanded, though, Henry rounded up the rebel leaders and killed them. Over 200 people were executed by the king, including members of the nobility, abbots, priests and monks. That, people, is how you defend the faith.